Let's just wait for the others to join us. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Sorry for the interruption. We'll just give the others a few more minutes. They should be back. Where are the others? Let's read a bit. Well, the overlap have a lot to do with policy as well from Josh. Would you care to explain that further, Josh? From Matt, you respond, referring to your notes, account thread, the right people, challenging. Okay. Partly, yes. Where are the others? Are we able to proceed? We're still missing 2. Do you think we could proceed? Okay, Janet is back. So I guess everyone is back. There's just one person who's missing. I can't really tell who it is. We could probably begin, right? We could just continue. So now, most of you who've tried to answer this have actually kind of provided a correct answer partly, though. Okay, so we're all here. Okay, so going back to the question, on what points would administrative law and constitutional law actually converge? And this is a very crucial point. There would actually be 2 areas. The first area would be in relation to principles. So there are certain principles of law that are actually quite common, both in administrative law and constitutional law. So these basic principles, for example, apart from separation of powers, these principles would relate, for example, to the principle of legality. And for those of you who will, obviously, as I said, you've probably taken up constitutional law or you're taking up constitutional law now. It is crucial that any decision of the government that impacts on people must be based on law. Now, when we say based on law, it could either be because it is based on the Constitution, or is based on a law passed by Parliament, or because it is within the residual power of the executive government. In other words, we will later see that as far as the executive government is concerned, there are certain things it can do without needing any law to be passed by Parliament. So in other words, there are certain residual powers of the executive. For example, the power to declare war. It doesn't need legislation in order for the executive, the prime minister, for example, to decide to go to war, or the power or its power to enter into relations with other states, or its power to put up certain government agencies. In these cases, the executive department has certain residual powers which it can exercise, and for the purpose of taking action. It does not require any law to be passed by Parliament for that. So that's part of the principle of legality. The other aspect of the principle of legality is that no person can be required by any government agency to do anything without without the presence of any law. So in other words, you cannot, for example, be compelled to put away your trash, or you cannot be compelled to mow your lawn if there is no law that requires you to do that. That's part of the principle of legality. So the principle of legality, so in other words, when in relation to administrative law in particular, before a government agency is able to take any action towards you or that affects you, there must be a law that the executive department is able to cite as its basis for affecting some of your rights. So that's one. That's one. Did anyone want to say something earlier? Kind of heard somebody want to say something. No? So that's one. The other aspect, as pointed out by Josh, is the rule of law. So in other words, it's a principle that is very common both to administrative law and constitutional law. That the principle of the rule of law, which mandates that any action taken by a government agency must be according to law. In other words, it must be on the basis of some objective standard. It cannot be subjective. It cannot be whimsical. It cannot be arbitrary. It cannot be ad hoc. So that is a requirement of the rule of law. The other corollary to the rule of law is that it is not just the individuals or the citizens of the state who are required to respect and obey the law. Even the people in power, including the prime minister, including the justices of the high court, are required to obey the law. Okay, so those are the two principles that are common both to administrative law and constitutional law. Now there is another area, and this one now is more contentious, and this is where this is crucial for both for administrative law and constitutional law. It's a very contentious area, and this is in relation to the power of the judiciary, especially in particular to the right of judicial review. Now, if we look closely at what administrative tribunals do, they actually adjudicate. They actually make decisions. Okay? Now, the first question that arises is, when Parliament, for example, passes a law that provides administrative tribunals the power to make decisions, that power that Parliament confers to administrative tribunals, is that a power that should exclusively lie with the judiciary? So that's a question one. Because if what is involved is a judicial power, then it is not within the power of Parliament to be able to delegate that power. This is particularly crucial in the context, which we touched on shortly, the question of separation of powers. This is particularly crucial in Australia or in Westminster forms of government, because unlike the US, for example, where you have a full separation of powers, where the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature are fully independent of each other. In a Westminster system of government, we know that the executive government, at least the heads of the executive government, with the prime minister and his cabinet, and the members, the government ministers are also part of the legislature. So they are not independent. So on the one hand, the executive, the prime minister, who is usually in control of political parties, can actually determine the legislative agenda. So as you can see, that shows that there is no independence between the executive department and the legislature. And on the other hand, the legislature can easily, can easily, as opposed to using the power of impeachment, the legislature can actually unseat a prime minister, at least in two ways. One, when the prime minister loses in parliament through a vote of confidence, or the prime minister is unable to pass supply legislation, or in other words, is unable to pass the law that relates to the government's national budget. In those two cases, the prime minister will have to resign as prime minister. So in that case, the parliament therefore has a power to unseat the prime, to remove the prime minister from his office. In a traditional setting where there is full independence across the judiciary, the executive, and the legislature, the only way by which the president, for example, or the head of the executive department can be unseated will have to be through the mechanism of an impeachment. As we saw, and as we will remember, for those of you who had the chance to follow the impeachment process of President Clinton in the United States, even if he had already been convicted in the Senate, he was convicted in the House of Representatives, but he was not eventually. He had been impeached by the House of Representatives, but he had not been convicted in the Senate, which allowed him to remain in power. But if you remember also as well the case of Richard Nixon in the United States in the 1970s, there was a very good chance that Richard Nixon would have been impeached by the legislature, meaning both by the House of Representatives and the Senate, which forced Nixon to resign. Okay, so that's one aspect. So, so the contentious area will be up to what extent can Parliament pass a law that will enable administrative tribunals to make decisions, and in what areas might they be encroaching on the judicial power? Because if there is an encroachment of the judicial power, the judiciary will not allow that. That's one. Okay. Now the second aspect, which is also crucial, is that typically, if you speak of the federal judiciary at least, it is impermissible, as you will later see in constitutional law, it is impermissible for the legislature to give, because the Constitution permits the legislature actually to determine the jurisdiction of courts. It is impermissible, as you will later see in constitutional law, it's impermissible for Parliament to clothe the judiciary with certain powers that are actually administrative in nature. So, for example, Parliament cannot pass a law that would entail that a member of the federal judiciary, whether the Federal Circuit Court or the Family Court or the Federal Court of Australia, they cannot be permitted to, let's say, conduct investigations. So, in other words, if you speak of an investigation, it actually means that even in the absence of contending parties, in the absence of a plaintiff or a defendant, Parliament is not permitted to clothe the federal judiciary with powers to conduct investigations, or let's say to provide them with certain police powers. That would be impermissible. Now that is also crucial. That point is also crucial because if you examine on the other hand, the context of states. In states, there's really a total absence of a separation of powers. Okay, let me repeat. In states, there's almost a total absence of separation of powers because in states, it is actually permissible for the state legislatures to pass a law whereby state judges actually undertake certain administrative functions. That is permissible. Okay, so are you able to appreciate so far the distinctions? Is everything clear so far? Clear so far? Now, I'm raising this. We're going to touch this later on, but I'm just raising those points at this point, okay? Because these are actually crucial points. But are you able to appreciate the distinction so far? Okay, now Josh is okay. Good. Now Josh is asking. Now, merit review. Okay. So what's the question, Josh, in relation to merit review? What's your question there?
So there's judicial review and then merit review, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So if something is supposed to be an administrative tribunal as such, that's more of a merit review, right?
Yes.
Because it's not judicial. Yeah, okay.
Yes, except that if you go by the case of Brian Lolor Automotives, the court has pointed out that even though administrative tribunals actually look at the merits of a case, in other words, they just look at whether the factual correctness of a decision. whether according to the law, the decision is actually correct. So it's not a question of, is it legal or is it illegal? Is it constitutional or is it unconstitutional? These are questions for the judiciary. So we're talking of correctness. However, according to the case of Brian Lawler Automotives, even administrative tribunals actually have an incidental function of looking at the legality. So in other words, it has to touch on legality because the administrative tribunal has to make a determination in the first place, does this law have a semblance of legality? And once it determines that that particular law has a semblance of legality, then it examines whether a decision, an administrative decision, was actually factually correct, according to what the law said. Okay? But that is primarily merit review. Whether or not according to the merits, the decision is correct. As opposed to whether or not is it legal, is it illegal, constitutional or unconstitutional. Okay, clear enough so far? Good. So we'll proceed to this question 3. Hold on, kind of lost that. There. So, why is, and we've kind of touched upon this, why is administrative law important to the separation of powers doctrine? Why is administrative law important to the separation of powers doctrine? I'll give you maybe 2 minutes, and if you could, just put your answers in the chat box. If you have the answers ready, you can start typing now.
Man, Joe, I'm going to have to go. I've got a POWS
okay.
teach.
Okay, thank you, Andrew.
No problem, thanks.
Okay, yeah, actually 7:28. We'll probably just end up to answering this question. There was just one more question, but we could just discuss that in the Moodle discussion. I don't want to keep you, longer than I should, because it's now 7:20. But let's try to answer that, however. Because when an executive arm from Josh, when an executive arm of the government makes an administrative decision, it can be held accountable to the judiciary. Okay. From Tracy, to ensure no section of the government has absolute power with decision making. Okay. From Janet, it's about impartiality. From Paul, because it gives recourse to dispute or contention independent of the lawmakers themselves. Okay, so a lot of these answers are actually correct. And we go back to that earlier discussion we had, whereby surely because there was a time, if you go back to the history of almost any nation, even in particular to Australia, in the olden days, maybe in the 1940s and in the 1950s, for people who were born then or who might have had relatives, who obviously had relatives then, actually during those times, the involvement of the executive government in the lives of its citizens was not as extensive and not as intensive as it is perhaps today. Would that be correct? Would it be correct to say, let me repeat that, would it be correct to say that the involvement or the influence of the executive government in the lives of the citizens in the 1950s, in the 1940s, were less extensive and less intensive as they are today? Would that be correct? What do you think? Yes? Why would you say yes? I mean, for example, if you talk about child support, if you talk about the way that the government is examining our use of the internet, the way that we deal with going to business, whether or not you should be paying rates, the executive government is more fully involved in our lives now. Okay? Before, it was like you go to the government for this and that. But now, there's stronger reliance by the people on the executive government. And therefore, it affects The executive government now affects people more. If you want to get into, if you want to put up a business, you have to go to the government, get a license of some sort. If you wanted to go teaching, you need to get a license. There was no such thing before. Do you follow me? Maybe if you wanted to become an electrician before, if you know how to do it, you can do it yourself. If you wanted to put up your own house, you could do it yourself. You don't need a license for that. If you wanted to build a house for your neighbor, you could do that. Now you can't. Would that be correct? So government has regulated a lot of activities that traditionally people had full independence to do. So you can't just be a teacher. You can't just be an engineer. You can't just be a nurse. You can't just be a doctor. That is now severely regulated. Would that be correct? It wasn't like that. It wasn't always like that before. And that's actually an observation, and that's actually the reason why you will often hear people say that administrative law is actually a newer phenomenon. It's actually a newer discipline. Now, because of the greater extent to which the executive government now affects and influences the lives of the people, mainly through regulation. Okay? So it could be regulation about, tapping of water. It could be regulation about fishing, how much fish you could catch, or whether or not you could drive a boat, or whether or not you could go scuba diving, or whether or not you could actually do, commit certain reckless behavior, or whether or not you could actually drive while you're drinking, or whether or not you could just push somebody. These are now heavily regulated. And because of the stronger involvement or the stronger influence of the executive government on the lives of the people, surely there has got to be a mechanism by which people could actually complain about excesses of government or find a way by which they could have decisions of the government reviewed. Now, it is crucial for the purpose of the separation of powers because it would be very difficult if every single time that there is a problem with government decision-making, you always have to have a recourse to the courts. So there has got to be a mechanism whereby there is almost a fourth. Well, there are some authors who would say that administrative tribunals actually do not belong to either the executive, the judiciary, or the legislature, but they're actually some kind of a fourth branch of government, in a sense. So it's almost like they're an independent, a fourth branch of government. And so that's why administrative law is important to the separation of powers, because that is a different mechanism by which excesses of government. It's like trying to listen to a strobe light. What's that? From Janet. What's like listening to a strobe light, Janet? I hope that's a good thing. Okay, so it's important because now excesses of the government or decisions of the government can actually be reviewed by administrative tribunals. Okay, Josh has got to go. So I guess that should be it for now. That's it's 7:34. Are there any questions before we end this? I hope you learned something. Did we learn something tonight? Do we have any questions so far? None? So would this be a good time for us to end the session? Okay, great. So I'll catch up with you next time. Okay, so I'm very happy, everyone, that you're here. And thanks for your participation as well. So I'll catch up with you next week. Bye.